I'm a truck driver, and I work the night shift. I like the quiet and the solitude of the night and the long stretches of empty road. It's peaceful, and it pays well. But tonight was different. As I was driving down the highway, I saw something move in the darkness. It was too big to be an animal and too fast to be a person. It was like a blur, a streak of movement that crossed the road in front of me and disappeared into the shadows. I slowed down, trying to see if I could catch another glimpse of whatever it was. But there was nothing. The darkness swallowed it up, and all I could see was the faint glow of my headlights on the asphalt. That's when I heard the sound. A low, growling noise that made my blood run cold. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was close. Too close. I hit the gas and tried to speed away, but it was too late. Something slammed into the side of my truck, sending it careening off the road and into the ditch. I was dazed and disoriented, my head spinning from the impact. But I knew I had to get out of there. I fumbled with the door handle and stumbled out into the night. That's when I saw it. The creature that had attacked me. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. It had the body of a bear, but the head of a wolf. Its eyes were glowing red in the darkness, and its teeth were bared in a snarl. I was frozen, unable to move as it approached me. But then, just as it was about to pounce, it suddenly turned and ran off into the woods. I was grateful to be alive, but I was also terrified. I had never seen anything like that before, and I knew that I was lucky to have survived. I got back in my truck and started driving again, hoping to put as much distance between me and that creature as possible. But as I drove, I realized that something was wrong. The air was thick with a sense of unease, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That's when I saw it. In the distance, there was a flickering light. It was coming from an old, abandoned house on the side of the road. I should have kept driving, but something drew me to it. I felt like I had to see what was there, and if it was safe, I could request them to let me stay the night. I pulled over and got out of my truck, walking towards the house. As I got closer, I could see that it was falling apart. The windows were boarded up, and the door was hanging off its hinges. I hesitated for a moment, but then I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was musty and stale, and the only light came from the flickering candle on the floor. I couldn't see anything else, but I could feel the presence of something else in the room. That's when I heard the laughter. It was high-pitched and manic, and it made my skin crawl. I turned towards the sound, but there was nothing there. And then I heard it again, coming from somewhere deep within the house. I knew I had to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear. I was already regretting my decision to visit this house. That's when I saw it. A shadowy figure, lurking in the corner of the room. It was like a person, but twisted and distorted, like something out of a nightmare. It started moving towards me, slowly at first, but then took pace. I was so scared and terrified that I turned and ran with all my life and got into my truck. As I continued driving, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. I had this unnerving sensation that I was being watched, and it sent chills down my spine. I tried to shake it off and turn my attention to the road, but my mind kept drifting back to that eerie feeling. Suddenly, my headlights illuminated something in the distance. At first, I couldn't make out what it was, but as I got closer, I realized it was a figure standing in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes, and my truck screeched to a halt just a few feet away from the figure. As I peered through the windshield, I saw that it was a woman, dressed in a tattered white dress. Her hair was disheveled, and she looked like she had been in a terrible accident. I rolled down my window and asked if she needed help, but she just stood there, staring at me with vacant eyes. I was about to get out of the truck when suddenly, she let out a blood-curdling scream that seemed to echo throughout the entire valley. I recoiled in terror and slammed my foot on the gas pedal, speeding away from the woman as fast as I could. My heart was pounding in my chest as I tried to calm myself down. I knew I had to keep my wits about me if I wanted to make it home alive. But just as I thought I was in the clear, something else caught my eye. In the distance, I saw a large, dark figure moving towards me. As it got closer, I realized that it was the same animal creature I had seen a few minutes ago. It lunged at my truck, and I could feel the impact as it hit the side of my vehicle. I swerved to avoid it, but it continued to pursue me, its eyes glowing in the darkness. I tried to speed away, but the creature was too fast, and I could feel its hot breath on my neck. In a moment of sheer desperation, I hit the brakes and slammed the door open, ready to make a run for it. But as I stepped out of the truck, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing before me was a group of people, all dressed in tattered white robes, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. They began to chant, and as they did, the creature behind me disappeared into the darkness. I tried to run, but I felt a force pulling me back towards the group. I struggled and fought, but it was no use. They had me in their grasp, and as they closed in, I knew that I was doomed. And that's the last thing I remember before waking up in a hospital bed, surrounded by doctors and nurses. They told me that I had been found on the side of the road, covered in bruises and scratches, with no memory of how I got there. But I knew the truth. I had come face to face with something truly evil, and I had narrowly escaped with my life. From that day on, I never drove that lonely stretch of road again, and I always made sure to keep my eyes peeled for anything that might be lurking in the shadows. Now let's hop onto story number 2, but before I begin reading, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. I was having a pretty bad day at work. Things weren't going as per plan, and there was a lot of backlog which was to be executed before the deadline. Thankfully, it was a Friday night, and the only motivation I had was the long weekend I had ahead of me. I had been driving for hours. My mind and body were exhausted after a long day on the road. As a truck driver, I'm used to the long hours and endless miles, but tonight was different. I felt something strange in the air, a presence that I couldn't explain. The darkness outside the windows seemed to thicken, the shadows deepening as if alive. The feeling of being watched crept over me, making me check the mirrors and the road ahead nervously. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, lurking just out of sight. I tried to brush it off, thinking it might be some deer hiding away in the bushes. As I went on driving, my truck started to shudder, the engine protesting as if in pain. I cursed under my breath, not wanting to break down in the middle of nowhere. This wasn't the first time when my truck stopped in the middle of the road. I had faced such instances before. But then this night was different. As the truck slowed down, I saw something in the headlights. A figure standing in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it might be some hitchhiker or someone lost. But as I got closer, the figure started to change, becoming more ethereal, more ghostly. I felt my blood run cold as I realized what I was looking at. The ghostly figure was a woman, her face twisted in pain and sadness. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, her long hair tangled and unkempt. I could see right through her, and she was glowing with an eerie light. Maybe she might have lost track and was lost for months. As I pulled over to the side of the road, the woman seemed to walk towards my direction, her eyes fixed on mine. I tried to shake off the fear that was creeping over me, but it was impossible. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The woman stopped next to my truck. She reached out a hand, knocking as calmly as possible as if there was nothing wrong with her. I can't begin to describe how terrifying that knock alone. I shouted at her to back off and go away. But the knock kept getting louder and faster. I gasped, the sound muffled by the terror that was choking me. The woman's voice was barely audible, a whisper in the wind. "Help me," she said, her eyes pleading with me. "Please, help me." I tried to speak, but no words would come out. My throat felt dry and constricted, as if I was being strangled. I felt like I was losing control of my own body, as if the ghostly figure was taking over. My head felt heavy. I tried restarting my truck and paid and cursed for it to start this time. I don't know if I was lucky of what, but the truck jump-started and I turned to look at that woman's direction again. The woman disappeared like she was never there. Her image faded into the darkness. I felt my truck shaking violently, the engine making a strange sound like a scream. I realized that I was no longer alone in my truck, that something else was there with me. The ghostly figure reappeared, her eyes blazing with anger. She reached out a hand and was banging her hands with anger on my truck. I could feel the coldness of her existence. All of a sudden there were bats and crows flying around above me in the sky. It was deafening. I could feel my consciousness slipping away, my body falling under her control. It was only when I thought of my family, waiting for me at home, that I was able to find the strength to fight back. I pressed the accelerator and without wasting any second drove off the road. I felt the grip of fear and terror slipping away. The ghost disappeared into the darkness, her form fading into nothingness. I breathed a sigh of relief, feeling like I had just escaped from the jaws of death. As I drove off, I looked back at the spot wondering if it really was a ghost or was it a woman trying to find her way back home. It was so terrifying that even the thought that night leaves me in sweat. If that figure was a woman trying to find her way back, I couldn't help but feel sorry for her. But the very possibility that she might be a shadow of my imagination or a ghost made me lose my mind. After that night, I never drove my truck alone. I always asked for someone to tag along and assist me. It was another long night of driving ahead of me. As a truck driver, I was used to the quiet of the open road, but something about tonight just didn't feel right. I was on my way to work, and my shift didn't start for a few more hours, but I liked to get an early start on my deliveries. It gave me time to take breaks and keep a steady pace throughout the night. As I was driving, I noticed a strange sensation in the air. It was as if there was some kind of presence in the truck with me, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the feeling only grew stronger. Suddenly, my truck began to sputter and shake. I knew that this wasn't just my imagination, my truck was in trouble. I cursed the maintenance guy under my breath and pulled over to the side of the road and tried to assess the damage. I knew that I was going to be late for work if I didn't fix it soon, but I also didn't want to risk driving any further with the truck in its current condition. As I was trying to fix the truck, I heard a strange noise coming from the nearby woods. It was almost like a faint whisper, but I couldn't make out what was being said. I tried to ignore it, focusing on fixing the truck, but the whispering only grew louder. I thought maybe some deer or kangaroo might be hovering around. I decided to take a detour to try and find somewhere safe to park and fix the truck. As I drove down a winding road, the whispering got louder and louder until it was almost deafening. I started to feel like I was being pulled into some kind of loop, driving down the same road over and over again. I was familiar with the route, but for some reason, I had never been on that road ever. Panic set in as I realized that I was lost in this strange loop, unable to escape. The whispering turned into a full-blown chorus of voices, each one chanting in unison. It felt like a crazy group of witches were having their time of their night somewhere around. I felt like I was going insane, trapped in this endless cycle. As I tried to break the cycle, the truck's headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was an apparition, a ghostly figure that seemed to be beckoning me closer. I felt a sense of dread wash over me, but I couldn't turn away. Maybe it really are just witches, I told myself, thinking that they aren't harmful. I stepped out of the truck, trying to get a better look at the figure. As I approached, the figure reached out and touched me. She had a long cloak around her body with hair down. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I realized that I had gotten myself into something strange and out of the world. I tried to run back to the truck. The voices continued to chant, the ghostly figure continued to beckon me, and I knew that I was doomed to something unspeakable. I climbed into my truck and kept finding my way out. I was worried about running out of gas or running into some wild wolf in that jungle. It was so terrifying that I almost believed that was the last day of my life. I started to cry thinking of my family back home when I heard a honking sound nearby. The road was on the other side of the road, and I decided to run my truck through it, ignoring all the possibilities of damage and accidents. To my luck, I got on the other side and drove right back home. I called in sick that day. I cannot explain what that person was or who she was. I can't explain the voices I heard and the chants they sang. I still am unsure if I really was in a loop or was some external force playing around me with me. Every time I think about that night, I lose my mind, unable to do anything else. I had been driving my truck on this deserted road for hours, and I was exhausted. The only light was coming from my headlights, and the sound of my truck's engine was the only thing that kept me company. I had been on the road so long that I couldn't even remember the last time I saw another car. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I saw something in front of my truck. It was too dark to make out what it was, but it looked like a figure standing right in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, and my truck screeched to a halt. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath and trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I thought maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but as I looked ahead, I could still see the figure standing there, motionless. I reached for my flashlight thinking that maybe somebody might be in need of help and got out of the truck. The air was cold and eerie outside, and my breath was visible in the darkness. As I approached the figure, it became clearer. It was a man, standing completely still, staring right at me. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, like something out of a different era. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need some help?" I asked, hoping to get a response from him. But he just stood there, staring blankly into space. I took a few steps closer, but he didn't budge. I asked again, "Hey, hope everything is good, mate?" But was again met with no response. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine. It was as if the world around me had stopped. I couldn't hear the sound of the wind, or even the sound of my own breath. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat. Then, as if nothing had happened, everything came back to life. The wind was blowing, and the sound of crickets filled the air. The man was gone. I looked around, but there was no sign of him. I got back into my truck and tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't budge. I tried again and again, but nothing happened. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no phone signal and no way to call for help. As I sat there in my truck, I started to feel like I wasn't alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. Then, I heard a sound coming from outside the truck. It was like someone was tapping on the window. I slowly turned my head to see what it was, and my heart skipped a beat. It was the man from before, standing right outside my window, staring at me with those lifeless eyes. I tried to start the engine again, but it was no use. The man just stood there, tapping on the window, and I was frozen in terror. What was going on? I had never felt so terrified. Suddenly, he started to fade away, disappearing into the darkness. I wasn't able to make sense of anything that was happening. After what felt like hours, my truck finally started, and I sped away from that place as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station, where I finally got out of the truck and took a deep breath. I'll never forget that night, and I'll never forget the feeling of being watched by that eerie figure on the road. Even now, years later, I still can't explain what happened. All I know is that it was the scariest experience of my life, and I never want to go through something like that again. I had been driving alone for hours, trying to reach my destination before sunrise. It was late at night, and I was exhausted. My eyelids felt heavy, and I could feel myself drifting off. I rubbed my eyes, trying to stay awake, and that's when I saw her. A woman stood in the middle of the road, directly in front of my car. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. I hit her with a sickening thud. Shaken, I stepped out of the car, fearing the worst. But there was no one there. I was pretty sure that somebody was there. The road was empty. I looked back at my truck, and it was acting abnormally. The headlights flickered, and the engine sputtered. I cursed under my breath and opened the hood. As I worked on the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I looked up, and there she was again. The woman in the white dress stood just a few feet away from me. Her face was twisted in a grotesque sneer, and her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. I was terrified, but I tried to keep my cool. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to sound calm. But she didn't answer. She just stared at me, her eyes never leaving my face. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you want?" I asked again, but she didn't reply. Instead, she just vanished into thin air. I was left standing there alone, with nothing but the sound of crickets and my own heavy breathing. I got back into my car, my heart racing. As I started the engine, the car began to shake violently. The radio turned on by itself, and I heard a low, whispering voice that seemed to come from nowhere. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The voice grew louder and more insistent, and I could make out the words now. "Please leave my child with me," it whispered. "I beg you to stay away." I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal and sped away as fast as I could. I didn't look back until I was miles away, and even then, I half expected to see her standing in the middle of the road again. When I shared this experience with my family, no one seemed to believe me. But from that day on, I never drove alone at night again. I always made sure to have a passenger, no matter how inconvenient it was. And even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I was never really alone.